Hello, welcome to 30 Minutes. I'm Rick Anthony. Several months ago, I interviewed Radnor Township Manager Bill White about microcells. It's a technology that can be used to improve wireless reception for residents, particularly those who don't benefit from having a nearby tower, one of those things that stands several stories high and ridiculously camouflaged with things to make it look like a tree. At the time, Bill had just moved into his new position, so he was busy with COVID and a number of other issues. But conversation about microcells was just beginning to emerge, particularly in communities that were becoming aware of the need for an upgrade in technology in anticipation of the new generation of wireless communication, specifically 5G. Soon after, the Board of Commissioners retained an outside firm to look at the federal and state laws that provide the impetus for the increase of microcell installations in the township as well as throughout the country. With me today for an encore appearance is Township Manager Bill White and his sidekick, Kevin Kochanski, who is the Director of Community Development for Radnor Township. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
I know it's busy this time of the year, particularly closing out the year, the activity year. But this is an important topic, and there are more and more people talking about it and asking about it. Bill, when you and I first talked last, it seemed to me at the time that there wasn't very much clarity about where, when, and by whom microcells could be installed in the township. I think that's changed.
To a degree it has, yes. As we talked about the last time we were on this topic, a lot of the where and how is regulated at the federal level. Radnor Township, while it's in our township, we don't have a whole lot of legal authority in those. And when it comes to providing network coverage, it's up to the carriers on how many of how they want to distribute their signal. So we can't necessarily ask them for additional coverage or less coverage, depending on what side of the issue you're on. It's ultimately up to the carriers, and then they comply with the federal government in terms of the particulars.
Speaking of clarity, could you offer a lucid definition of what a microcell is? It's not one of those towers. It's something considerably smaller, but still significant size.
So microcells are a subset of a small wireless communication facility. They are governed under Act 50 of the federal regulations, and there are specific definitions in there. So when an application is submitted, ultimately the township is under specific timeline requirements to review the applications for completeness, and then through that review process, we would basically go page by page through the ordinance line by line to determine how it's classified, if it is appropriately classified by the applicant, determine which set of regulations it would fall in.
I'm a technological idiot, but my understanding is that you need more microcells than you would with a big tower because they have weaker signals and it's straight lines, so if you have to go from A to B and B to C and so on, which means more of them, is that correct? Closer together than you would have with a large tower. Am I correct?
Well, I think it depends on the technology being used at the time, the topography of the area. A flatter area with less density in trees and homes, with less topographical relief, you could probably get away with fewer facilities. So I think it's a very site area specific issue that the providers ultimately are going to determine what meets their requirements in terms of coverage.
Yeah, and then we had talked about last time as 5G is introduced, and as consumers, we're using more of the technology. So I think we use the metaphor of you're going from a 2-lane to a 4 or 5-lane highway, and the from the big towers to the microcells, it's just bringing that signal closer to the end user with more bandwidth.
And as a result of the study that I referenced earlier that the Board of Commissioners had requested, there will soon be an ordinance in Radnor Township that didn't exist before covering wireless communication, both microcells as well as towers. Although there aren't many towers and we don't expect too many more, do we?
Well, So a couple things. First, the township did have a wireless facility ordinance on the books. Our conversation, along with some residents on both sides of the issue. We have residents that are
Yes.
in need of better signal, and then we also have residents who have concerns about too much signal. Those conversations, that was the genesis to reviewing the existing ordinance, and the commissioners had asked the consultant that we hired to come in and take a look at that. The consultant immediately identified that our ordinance was out of date, and that updates were prudent to protect the township in the areas where we do have any kind of latitude, to make sure that those were up to date as much as possible. So that's the work that they did, and that's the
Yes.
ordinance that'll be reintroduced here in the coming year.
But to your earlier point, the township, no other municipality, has very much latitude. My understanding, if I'm correct, is that I'm going to pick, if AT&T came in and said, we want to put X number of microcells in this area because the community needs better service and we want to be able to provide better service. Therefore, I'm making this up. We're going to put in 5 microcells in this neighborhood at these locations, and we're going to do it within the next 6 months. Here's our application. Here's everything you need to be sure that we're in compliance, and if we're not, tell us and we will. But we're going to do it because the law says we can.
Yeah.
Yes, that is correct. That ultimately, the provisions that are coming with the new ordinance put more of the onus on the township to act within a certain timeline, but ultimately the providers have the ability under federal regulations to make those installations under the federal guidelines.
Okay, so I live in a community where we have poor service. And I'm not alone. There are other communities in my part of the township who just don't get I have to go to the top of my driveway, turn 45 degrees to get a decent signal. I'm not kidding, on certain days. So we pray for better service. Many people in our community have asked, well, what's going on? Again, their belief is it's the township who should be taking the initiative to do whatever is necessary to improve wireless service in our community. It's particularly important, as you know, because we're across from the Willows, and the Willows is a low-lying area, and there's virtually no wireless service there, which creates a potential problem in the event of an emergency. And I'm sure you know that story, you've heard it over and over again. So we have the concern as a community, we have a concern as having the Willows adjacent to our community, and many of our residents use it. So we invited one of the utility companies in to talk with us, and they were very good. The lesson we learned is we were right in taking the initiative, we were correct in inviting them in to talk with us. So now we have a collaboration going on, and we have hope, anyway, that they're not going to storm in one day and put in 3 microcells wherever they damn well please. Those locations, the number of microcells has already been determined. They did the engineering and said, this is what you need. It's where they will be placed and how they will be placed and what equipment will be put in place. Because as I understand, also, the design of these towers, poles, is also changing, thank goodness. It's not just what is currently in place, a telephone pole, existing utility pole with an extension and a big brown box hanging from it. Now, I think they can at least include all the electronics in the base of the pole, or I understand there's new technology, they can bury the electronics. And so, no, it's not so bad, particularly if you can design the microcell so it's an integral part of a street light.
Yeah.
Which is important to a community like ours and others because we don't have poles already, we're all underground. I've just shot my wad, that's all I know.
Well, so the design guidelines definitely have come a long way from where we were 10, 15 years ago. And in most cases, when you're walking through an urban area downtown, you're probably walking by microcells and have no idea because they are incorporated into existing infrastructure, whether it be a street light or a traffic light or some other structure that has some height to it that can promote the signal. And that's where, I think a lot of these carriers, when they decide to come into an area, they want to be good neighbors. But at the end of the day, they have to, they are going to do what they have to do to promote their business within
Yeah.
the federal law. So if the day comes where we're in your neighborhood and looking at some sort of microcells, hopefully, we're working with a carrier that's willing to meet us on the design guidelines and the location, and so it does match the character of the neighborhood. Because that's another concern, not just the medical concerns about the radio waves emitting from these signals, but also the aesthetics and how they look.
And just to follow up on that, one thing that is new with the revisions that are coming forward is a design guideline manual, which we didn't previously have.
Oh.
So it's a kind of a two-part. You have the ordinance and regulations that are compliant with the federal regulations, and then we have the design guidelines that really kind of address the siting and the aesthetic aspect of these facilities.
So you said guidelines. Are you using that word advisedly? Can you enforce?
I think we look for compliance. So again, as an application is submitted, not only are we bouncing it off of the ordinance regulations and zoning provisions, but then how does the aesthetics and the location of that marry up with the design guidelines as well?
Does the ordinance require the utility company to involve the community?
I don't believe so. I believe they're allowed to come in. It's up to us to determine, through the checklist, are they compliant? Are they certifying that they're compliant?
Right.
The size of the facilities, where the accessory equipments are located, and things
But
like
there's
that.
nothing like a developer who comes in and the township requires them to send communications to the affected residents in the community. Nothing like that.
There is some notification requirements in there for certain types of facilities, and that's where the nuances of the code, how it's going to be classified, what they're certifying it as versus what we believe it is, and then the notification back out to them. But there is a community notification provision in the code for certain facilities.
Suppose in my community, for example, I think there were 3 providers, generally speaking. Suppose those 3 providers all decided that they want microcells in our community. Could they, each of them, put up their own microcells? Or is the requirement that they all share one facility?
There are co-location requirements in the code. It's obviously cheaper for a utility provider to co-locate versus putting new infrastructure in. In most cases, we've seen co-locations when we're talking non-small wireless communication facilities. Again, because of the economies of scales of putting in a new tower structure. And while a light pole is not as expensive as a larger tower, there's still costs there. So we find in these types of situations where they're more interested in co-locating than not.
And if they're, just to add to that, if they're all coming in at the same time, I think that increases the chance of co-location. And we do have some areas in the township where an existing site with carrier A is already there. They have a relationship with whoever the manufacturer is of that site, and they don't play nice with that one, so they do put their own location up several feet away. So
they could do that?
It could. We have sites in town now where that happens.
But that was before the ordinance.
Yeah, but that's not within our ordinance. That's where we get into the federal law, and the federal law dictates those types of stipulations, not our ordinance. I mean, so the ideal situation, going back to your neighborhood, would be you get multiple carriers that come in all at the same time, because that's gonna result most likely in co-location.
They all come in at the same time and agree to share the microcell, the tower, whatever it is.
Yeah, because it's not the carriers themselves that are operating the microcell site.
Yeah.
It's a third-party company. The third-party company owns the microcell, and they're contracted with the provider to send the signal.
Then I'm incorrect in something I thought I understood. I thought there was, and I won't mention the carrier, I thought there was one carrier who insisted they wanted to have their own, and they didn't want anybody else with them, and they erected their own on their own existing pole.
So we do have a situation, we might be thinking of the same one, where it is a single carrier site, but the site is operated by a third-party company. But it is only sending the signal out of that one carrier.
Yeah.
Several feet away, there's another site operated by a different microcell company
Right.
that is carrying 2 other signals.
So a carrier, AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile, a carrier would contract with a Crown Castle, for example,
That's one of
who's
many.
in the business
Yep.
of installing micro towers and everything else, wireless communication technology.
Yep.
Yeah, of all sorts around the world. So the carrier would contract with Crown Castle or another company like it to do all the engineering, install the microcell, and then be responsible for the maintenance of the microcell.
Yes.
Okay, let's go back to how does a community coerce,
Advocate?
advocate, appeal, petition the carriers to make the investment to put the microcells in, because as you know, 5G is here.
Yeah.
And too many of our areas in this town just aren't ready for it. The
Well, not,
infrastructure
yeah,
is-
and compounding that concern is that as consumers, our reliance on cell phones is only increasing.
Yes.
Many folks don't even have a landline phone in their homes anymore. So it has increased the importance of having a adequate cell coverage. You know, in our various discussions over the last 2 years on this topic, and talking both directly with carriers themselves and with the companies that operate these microcells, it's advocating to the carriers, because they're ultimately the ones
Yes.
that are going to decide whether your neighborhood needs more coverage or not. It's not something the township can push. It's not even really a political issue. It's a commercial issue where the consumers need to be the ones, the voice behind the.
Even in the case of public safety, as with the Willows?
We can certainly advocate, and as a township, we will continue to do that with the representatives that we're in touch with from those companies. But at the end of the day, we are a consumer as well, and we can't mandate additional, and we certainly can't mandate a specific type of site. I think if the carriers were sitting here, they would say that there were other options presented at those sites that would have solved the problem. The township elected not to move forward with those.
Such as a tower.
Yeah. So that's where we can continue to advocate. We can continue to push the carriers.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, we need them to agree that what we're asking for is what they want to do.
Yeah. So yeah, let me sure I understand. In the final analysis, the township has very little control or influence over when, where, and by whom microcells will be installed in this township, as is the case in all other municipalities.
Yeah.
Yes.
That is an accurate summarization.
Yeah. So what do you say to the individual resident who says, I don't want one in my front yard, or to a community that says, we're all underground, we don't want poles all over our streets? What do you say to those residents?
Yeah, and
Excuse me.
in doing this job now for almost 2 years,
It's only 2 years?
from microcells to you name it, to traffic controlling, to other utility issues.
Yeah.
We find ourselves often in a position where it's our residents, but it's not necessarily something that we have control over. We had an issue where there was a dam that was a failing dam that needed to be repaired. Ultimately, the owners of that dam decided to get rid of it. We didn't have a whole lot of say in that, and it did cause impacts to our residents. So that's another example of, folks look to the township, and we're happy to help and push and do our part. But at the end of the day, some of these things are just outside of our legal purview. So what I would say to a neighbor, one of your neighbors, or anyone else on either side of this issue is, if you want additional coverage, you got to let your carriers know. The higher you go up on the elected totem pole, probably the bigger voice you get. If you can get state and federal legislators to champion your cause, especially at the federal level, because that's where the law resides that these folks have to live with.
Why couldn't the Board of Commissioners petition the major carriers to do a study in the township to determine what's needed and how best to solve the problem.
So they could petition if
It's
the
only
board
that.
of
It's
if
only-
the board of commissioners came together and as a group decided they
Yeah.
wanted to push that, they certainly could.
On behalf of the residents.
Absolutely, yeah.
Who individually don't have much clout. But if the Board of Commissioners were to, on behalf of its constituents, make an appeal to at least get serious about coming into this township where we have some serious public safety issues, for example, in the Willows, and give us a plan. So you must have some plans, utility companies. What are you going to do over the next 5 years, and how do we fit in?
Sure. The other side of that, though, our commissioners are hearing from residents that feel very differently about the technology, and so the commissioners are, they find themselves in a difficult spot.
Yes.
And
But the point is, it's coming. There's no way to stop it. It is coming. So how can we best manage to the best interest of the residents of the township? And the answer is collaboration, partnership, and so on, and communication. I think a lot of people, in my opinion, a lot of people have been against it because of bad information or misinformation. They just don't know. First of all, they don't know that they really don't have much say. And so the better thing to do is, instead of saying no, say how.
Absolutely. I will say that the few folks that I've been in touch with that have concerns about the technology they're very, very educated on the topic.
Yes.
And ultimately they boil down to.
No, I'm not saying they're ignorant, not at all.
But they're very
Very
knowledgeable
adamant, yeah.
about this particular
And they're concerned about the health issues particularly.
Yeah.
And that's a legitimate concern.
Yeah.
And have the residents stay engaged if they're part of the process early on as an application's coming in.
Yes.
Before the carrier or the applicant gets ingrained with hard engineering. There's opportunities there to
Yeah.
choose a different design or choose a slightly different location
Yeah.
and still meet the coverage requirements. But if those concerns aren't being brought forward early in the process, the carriers are more likely to push forward with.
But as you said, there's no requirement on the part of the utility company to notify the residents that there is a study underway, for example, or that over the next 6 months we're going to be coming in.
Well, if there's a study on the way, that's where the township can help, and we certainly will. We can
tell
help.
me how.
Well, we can help promote that. We can say that there is a study underway. If we're aware of it, and we're certainly we are going to be involved in some capacity. We can help promote, what's going on to the neighborhood.
Go back for a moment, please. They have to do some preliminary engineering to determine how many sites and where the microcell, how many microcells and where they should be located. Does that require a permit?
For
from
the
township?
study, not for a study. If they're doing kind of their due diligence to
Right.
determine
Yes.
where in a particular community that they would like to go and a shortage of coverage, they don't need to notify the township.
I
They're
didn't
out
think
doing
so.
their due
Right.
diligence.
So at what point and how would the residents be notified that there is some initiative underway by a utility company?
Well, I think twofold. If it's an actual application, again, there are notification
Yes.
requirements depending on the type of application. So residents would receive notification depending on the
From
proximity.
the township or by the
By
utility?
the applicant, but the applicant is required to
Okay.
inform the township that they have provided that notification. If it's just a study for their due diligence, then we may not be aware of it, that they're ongoing due diligence in their study to determine the adequacy of coverage.
Yeah, and it's hard to tell because these days there's so much going on in the township everywhere, and so there are trucks and utilities and all kinds of people with site things and all kinds of apparatus all the time, taking surveillance one from one. It's hard to tell what's going on and who's doing what and how it's going to affect me ultimately.
In a lot of cases, as Kevin pointed out, we're not on that front end of it. For example, last year we had just had some streets paved in a certain neighborhood, a town, and literally the next week Aqua was there shooting engineering lines for a water line replacement in that same neighborhood. And so we learned of it and what time out?
Yeah.
He said, please don't,
Yeah.
not yet.
Yeah.
But that's happening all the time. What I was referring to earlier, where the township can help promote, is if we're on the front end, if we're aware of a neighborhood that has concerns and would like greater coverage, we can, we have connections at at least two of the carriers. We have people that have been in some of these meetings and have helped educate us on the process. We could continue to advocate on that end. And I feel confident in saying that if there were movement based on the meetings that we've had, if the carriers come back to the table and say, you know what, yes, we are going to move in that area, that they would include us, because it's been an ongoing conversation now for, I've been involved for 2 years, but I know this has been a much longer conversation.
Let me tell you how frustrating it is, though. Again, going back to my community, we said, okay, let's have all of our residents contact their carriers. Okay, now what information can we provide to make it easier for them? Let's see if we can get the name and contact information for the Vice President of Customer Relations, seems logical, right? With each of the carriers. I couldn't get that information. Nobody answers a phone.
Right.
You get plugged into an automated system. You can't reach these people. So it was really frustrating trying to come up with something, some connection, a human being you could talk to. Crown Castle, to their credit, was different because, as you know, they have someone who works with communities.
Yeah, and they have the relationships with the carriers too.
Yes.
So that's a good advocate to have.
So again, the bottom line is it is the responsibility of residents and communities to do whatever is necessary to learn as much as they can, to petition the carriers to come in and upgrade service in anticipation of 5G. And the township will support, but not very much, because you can't.
To the extent we can. Yeah, and support's a tough word, just because we have to be somewhere in the middle between the pros and the cons, and ultimately the commissioner can help drive that message. But we can help advocate. We can help the communication. We can help spread the word when we know of a project or if something's going on, and we're happy to do that.
Okay. Can you get me the contact information for the Vice President of Customer Relations at Verizon? Because I can't get
We can we can try through our contact.
No, seriously, I figured that the township has high-level connections with all the carriers, because you have to.
Well, we have specific agreements with Verizon, and we have a cable franchise agreement because they provide cable services.
Same with Comcast.
Yep. So that gives us someone on the other end of the phone, and we could certainly start there.
Okay.
At least we're starting with a human, and we can try to find the other humans that are involved in this. Okay.
Well, I'm sure there will be many more conversations about microcells. And those who are opposed, I certainly understand it. I do have concerns about the health issues as well. But like so much of this technology, you got to take the good with the bad and pray that it's all going to work out at the end. Furthermore, I hope the technology is just getting better to help mitigate some of the health issues. And I don't know if that's the case or not. You would know whether.
Well, ultimately, all of that falls under the federal regulations. So the federal regulations dictate what are the acceptable levels of exposure, what are the maximum and minimum levels of broadcast signal, and as long as the carrier is certifying that they're within those limits, the township can't do anything. We're bound by the federal regulations.
I'm almost choking on this next question, but is there a risk that the township would be liable in the event of some mishap, even though you have little control over what they do and how they do it?
Yeah, I'm always careful not to play lawyer, but being that the township does not regulate this, nor do we permit it, no, I don't think there's any liability that we're carrying in this regard.
Okay, but everybody can sue anybody. So.
And at the end of the day, our concern is for our residents. So we want to be cognizant of that and do what we can on that front.
Well, thank you again. I really appreciate you coming here to try to shed some light on this. It really is a complicated issue and frustrating because none of us has very much control over it.
Right, yeah.
But we'll see how it all shakes out. Again, thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure.
My guests today have been Bill White and Kevin Kochanski, who have tried to bring some light on the issue of microcells. Until next time, this is 30 Minutes. I'm Rick Anthony. Take very good care of yourselves.